Good morning, everybody. Yeah, thank you very much for the generous words of introduction. Thank you also to Tim and to Mr. Luddy for the wonderful opportunity to be here, this invitation. It's an honor to be here at Thales. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to go back and revisit a set of issues that has exercised me for quite some time now, the role of classical education in our modern world. Yeah, so when we talk about education, there's, I think those of us who've been in the field for a long time know that there's lots of different trends about education. Every 5 minutes somebody seems to be coming along with a new idea about how people learn or how people should teach. These are trends that tend to attract a certain following for a while, and then they come and go. After a while, I think some of us can get a little bit impatient with that, and so it's, I think, quite natural for many people want to try to find some safe haven, some anchor with regard to education, something that is not going to come and go, that's something that looks a little bit more stable. And I think for many of us, classical education serves as this kind of a model. But when there's talk of classical education, some people seem to find this old-fashioned. It sounds a little bit outdated in the ears of a lot of people. When you look at the modern world, it's dominated by fast changes in the social order, technological development. So that raises a natural question. Why on earth would someone think that an educational program based on learning dead languages or studying cultures that perished a couple thousand years ago, why on earth would that be relevant in any way for the complexities of modern life? Are we as educators, are we really acting responsibly when we insist on an old model of education like this? Is this really doing our young people any service? Wouldn't they be better off studying things which are more directly relevant for the kinds of real-life challenges that they're going to encounter later? So these are the kind of concerns and objections that I think all of us as teachers of classical education are used to hearing, and I think they're worth taking seriously. Although classical education has served people well in previous ages, there's no immediate a priori reason for us simply to infer from this that it could in any way be relevant for life in the 21st century. Yeah, so in this paper, I want to try to address this quite complex constellation of questions about whether classical education is, in fact, still appropriate in a globalized world. And I want to argue, in fact, that it is. And in fact, it's even more important and more relevant today than it's ever been in past ages. In order to make this case, it's going to be necessary to recall and to define more closely what we really mean when we talk about classical education, what is involved in this concept. And this discussion will help us to determine first what's classical about this program of education, that is, what elements of it reflect something from the classical world, and also how well it's suited to answering the needs of the modern world in which we live. And so I want to try to show that at least some of what we usually understand by classical education is in fact based on a kind of a cliche that we need to think critically about and we need perhaps to revise. But then once we undertake this revision, I think we'll be able to develop an educational program that is truly classical in that it's an accurate reflection of certain elements of Greek and Roman culture. But moreover, this revision that I want to suggest in our understanding of classical education will also have the additional benefit that it will enable us to argue for its importance and relevance more effectively today. And so then, with this revised conception of classical education, at the end of my paper, what I want to do is to reflect upon this broader question of what classical education could mean in the context of the globalized world in the 21st century. And here I want to argue that classical education is indeed well suited to respond to the demands to produce well-functioning citizens equipped to face effectively the challenges of this complex, fast-changing modern world that we all live in. Here at the outset, I'd like to submit that the terms of the critical discussions about classical education are often based on misunderstandings and perhaps stereotype conceptions of what this kind of education really means. I want to try to show that people are often victims of what I regard as a kind of a modern prejudice that's based on modern specialization, which in fact distorts our understanding of the past. And my thesis is that this distorted understanding of what constitutes classical education is what leads to a lot of these problems that we are used to hearing about relevance. Instead, I want to submit that if we could modify our conception of classical education, then we can find that we can make substantial headway with regard to meeting this question about this objection of relevance. And so my goal is, in short, then to take this opportunity to test our intuitions concerning classical education. Some people might perceive this as being somehow provocative, but my goal, let me assure you, is not to provoke anybody, but rather simply to go back and re-examine this idea of classical education that we all put so much stake in. I think that it's important for us as teachers of education, of classical education, to occasionally go back and revisit this question. I'm sure you get asked these kind of questions all the time, either from your students or from parents, or okay, what is classical education? What do you mean by that? And I think it's good that we have a clear sense of what all is involved there, and that we're also critical about that. This doesn't have to be an entirely static conception, but one that we have to think carefully about. I think, let me just say briefly a word about myself and about my work. This is the kind of thing that I think is important to do in academic work and research, the kind of work that I'm used to doing. Very often when I embark upon a new book, what I do is to look into a specific research field, and I try to identify certain fixed beliefs that scholars in that field have assumed uncritically. So these are, in any given field you can find these, they're basic foundational points for starting and stopping, but nobody ever really looks at them critically. So then I try to go to work, roll up my sleeves, do the research, and try to determine if there's really anything to these beliefs. And very often, I find that there are certain beliefs that have established themselves simply because somebody said that a long time ago and then 10 people repeated it. Right? But if one looks a little more carefully, one can see that there's not really good evidence to support that view. In fact, there's quite compelling and overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And so in most of my books or longer things that I've written, I start out by sketching, here's this given belief that we in this field are all familiar with, here's the conventional wisdom, here's our traditional way of thinking, and then I go on to explain that this book or this article is about calling into question that view, right? And then I try to present the evidence for that, and then I get to the truly, what I find that the truly interesting part, the exciting part for me, all right, if what I'm saying is correct, if that old view is mistaken in some fundamental way, well, what does that mean? That means we have to go back and revise not just that view, but all the other ones that are related to it. And then suddenly that area of research starts to look quite different. And that's what I find very interesting and exciting about research, discovering new ideas, right? Discovering new perspectives, new ways of looking at things. Of course, it should be noted here that one doesn't always make a lot of friends by doing this, right? Right. People are, particularly scholars, I'm sad to say, vehemently resist new ideas, right? Nobody likes to hear that the ideas that they've held for a long time are mistaken, or that, particularly if they've been teaching them to young people for a long time, that's not what they want to hear. And so very often they're quite reluctant to listen to whatever new evidence I have to present. But I think that this is what academics, this is what scholarship's all about. I mean, if we're not able to revise our views and critically think about them, then what are we doing here, right? If the scholarship's just about holding on to some orthodoxy the whole time, then we've abandoned the idea of critical thinking. So this is what I try to do, and even though it's not always easy given the whatever audience one is up against sometimes, I think as scholars, if we discover overwhelming and compelling evidence that calls into question a beloved belief that some people have today, we have a certain moral obligation as scholars to present that and to try to make a case for it, even though some people might get upset with that. Yeah, so this is just a brief word about me. Let me then proceed here with our basic question, right? Let's begin by asking this question: what do we mean by classical education? So just enjoin you, take a moment to ask yourself, what does this mean to you in connection with your own teaching? I think usually classical education, it's associated with the humanities fields, literature, history, drama, and so forth. And so the standard definitions tend to say something like the following. This is a little bit arbitrary, but I think you will immediately recognize this. Definitions like this in any case that say something to this effect: that classical education is a program of studies that is based primarily on the humanities, covering the languages, literature, history, art, and other cultural elements that had their origin in ancient Greece and Rome. So something an entirely uncontroversial conception of what classical education is. So according to this standard story, it's from the ancient Greek and Roman authors that we've received this rich heritage from these fields that constitutes the basis of Western culture. And then in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, this Greco-Roman canon became a part of a formalized course of study in Europe, and it's that course of study that we today have inherited in, of course, many different forms, but that's the origin of it. Now, while there is, of course, some truth in definitions like this, what I want to suggest is that there are also some misunderstandings which lie concealed in this generally accepted view. And so in what follows, I want to try to identify three different kinds of prejudices which I think can be found in this common understanding of classical education and the educational policies that are based on this. Yeah, first, it'll be noted that in the definition that I just gave, that there's not a single word mentioned about sciences or technology. Right? Indeed, today we tend to think that education in the sciences is more or less the polar opposite of that of classical education. The standard view is that these two things have absolutely nothing to do with one another, and that the fields of knowledge that are involved are simply different in kind, right? What we're doing in physics is different from what we're doing in literature or history. But here I want to argue that here is where we find our first fundamental misunderstanding of what classical education really means. Right? Today we tend to think of Aristotle almost exclusively as a philosopher, but his philosophical studies constitute only, in fact, a part of his corpus. He was, of course, also a natural scientist, specifically a botanist, a geologist, a physicist, zoologist, an anatomist, and so on. But these quite substantial aspects of his work, they tend to be largely neglected today. If this doesn't sound right, then maybe we could just take a quick poll here, ask how many people here have read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, his Metaphysics, or his Politics. Right, I guess it would be a fair number. And then ask the question, how many of you have read his work on the generation of animals? Probably not so many. Eh? It's, of course, no secret that the world has received from the Greeks and the Romans not just highbrow studies about literature, history, philosophy, but also the sciences. Right? Who's not heard of the great Greek mathematicians such as Euclid and the scientists Archimedes? But the problem is that these fields of the sciences are not usually counted as belonging to the core of classical education, which, as just noted, is usually reserved for the humanities disciplines. Usually the sciences are radically separated from these fields. But this is, I think, entirely arbitrary, and it's a result of modern specialization. Right? We tend to want to put certain things into certain pigeonholes. We have the sciences here, we have the humanities here, and these are different in kind. But why don't the sciences count for classical education? If classical education means, per definition, what comes from the Greeks and the Romans, then the sciences, too, are a part of that rich cultural heritage that we've received from them. When we think of the Roman classics, we invariably think of literary texts such as Virgil's Aeneid or Livy's History of Rome, but we don't think nearly as readily of Vitruvius's book on architecture or Frontinus's book on aqueducts, these books that are more about the Roman technology. We can also see this if you look at any given university, the way in which it organizes the different departments. So the classics department is almost invariably a part of a larger department of literature. Of course, nobody thinks the classics belongs in the sciences, but I mean, it shows you people who are working in the classics, who are studying the Greeks and the Romans, they're not usually so interested in this element of the sciences. The classics departments tend not to treat the culture of the classical world in a generally representative manner because of this. I think more troubling, I believe, is our modern tendency to separate science from the humanities and from culture in general. It's as if there's some fundamental belief that science is something apart from the rest of human culture, as if it develops on its own in a vacuum somehow. But of course, in reality, this is not the case. The development of science always goes hand in hand with other social and cultural developments. And so there's a reciprocal influence of the one sphere on the other. And so my suggestion here is for us to try to look beyond this modern blindness that sees science as something different in kind from culture and the humanities, instead to come to regard it as a fundamental and integral part of human culture as a whole. I think that this is an important insight for us as educators who have an investment in classical education, since this idea that we can modify our handed-down conception of what classical education means by making room for the sciences as an integrated part in it. This is, I think, a valuable thing that we can do to increase the relevance of classical education, but also to present a program for classical education that is more classical, that is more veridical with the way in which the Greeks and the Romans conceived of things. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to be fooled into a false separation of these disciplines based simply on the division of fields in a common college catalog. I think science belongs every bit as much to classical education as does history and poetry. I now want to move to another example of what I take to be an oddity in our standard conception of classical education. It will be noted again that in that standard definition of classical education that I gave at the start, that there was no mention of religion. Once again, I think that it's a common perception that religion is something different in kind from the traditional fields of classical education. In many cases, indeed, great care has been taken to make sure that no form of religious instruction whatsoever appears in the curriculum of classical education. Again, this is, I think, a result of our modern specialized way of thinking. Everything has its pigeonhole, right? We have classical literature here, classical history here, and then we have religion over here. These are, I think, regarded very often as different things which fit into different compartments. But I submit that this is another example of a modern prejudice that, instead of being in harmony with classical education, in fact, radically departs from it. Let me give you a couple examples. The works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are often taken as the paradigm cases of text which belong to the classical canon. I mean, if anything, surely Homer, right, belongs to classical education. Right? We have wonderful works of literature. Some would argue we even hear in Homer some vague whispers of history here. This sounds entirely intuitive and completely uncontroversial, but I wish to submit that this is in part an anachronistic misunderstanding based on a modern perspective. For the ancient Greeks, the Greeks of the archaic or the classical period, the Homeric poems were not simply regarded as secular works of literature or history. Rather, these were the objects of great religious reverence. These poems, along with Hesiod's Theogony, were the Greeks' main sources of information about their gods and the origins of their deepest religious beliefs and practices. Let's take another example. Surely the Greek dramas of Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, and Aristophanes belong to classical education. They're the origin of many different forms of modern entertainment we have today, from film to theater. They tell us these wonderful stories about ethical duties and responsibilities. They also contain great insight into the human mind, human spirit. Yeah, they've been the source of endless examples for specialists who work in the fields of ethics or psychology. And of course, it's not difficult, given this, to see how this aspect of Greek culture has had a profound influence on modern thinking in all these different areas. But for all of this, there's also a distortion. Greek drama for the Greeks themselves, it's not primarily about art, it's not primarily about entertainment or human psychology. It's about religion, right? The Greek drama arose from the Greek religious rites to the god Dionysus. Dramatic works were always performed in connection with religious festivals. These were never conceived by the Greeks as purely secular works of art or literature. This is our modern way of thinking, or if you prefer, as I like to say, a modern prejudice that we are imposing on the classical world here. This is just one other very brief example to illustrate the same point. We see the same thing in other traditions. In the Hindu classic, the Ramayana, of course, Rama is the great hero who's regarded by the modern reader as some sort of a superhero going around doing all these great things. But again, this is a modern misconception of the story. People tend to forget, of course, that Rama is not just a modern secular hero. He's the seventh avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu, right? So once again, there's a profound religious dimension in this text, as there are in most any ancient text you care to find. And it's this religious element which I think is overlooked in our modern readings of these texts. Why is it then that we tend to think of the classics or literary and historical texts, we tend to think of the classics as literary and historical texts rather than religious ones? Why do we tend to exclude the idea of religion from the curriculum in classical education? I think the reason for this has to do with the origin and the development of the field that we know today as classical studies. Originally, it was the German philologist Friedrich August Wolff who is credited with coining the term Altertumswissenschaft, which means literally simply the science of antiquity. He's the founder of the field that we know of as classics or classical studies today. He was the first person to establish a department of classical studies at the University of Halle in Germany in 1787. Now, during Wolff's time, the study of Latin and Greek at the university was always something that fell under the purview of the faculty of theology. But Wolff, he yearned to read thinkers like, writers like Homer in a secular context. And so he developed a degree of animosity towards some of his colleagues at the Faculty of Theology, since they had, in effect, monopolized the study of Latin and Greek. So his mission was then to create a university institute that was dedicated to the study of the classical languages in a way that was independent of theology. And thus, when this department was established, right, the birth of classical studies as we know it, right, it was specifically in opposition to theology. So in this context, there was a tendency for this budding field of classics to identify itself with literature, with history, with philosophy, that is, with fields which were rather different from those in theological studies. But this, of course, meant then selectively focusing on specific aspects of the ancient world and ignoring others. Also, when one was reading certain texts, specifically focusing on certain elements of that and ignoring the religious elements. And as a result, scholars in this field and those that sprang from it, they tended to read these ancient texts in a secular manner and to ignore whatever religious elements or connotations they contained. Now, the story that I just told in that given time and place in the Enlightenment, I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? But in the broader picture, right, I think we can easily see that this is rather a distortion of the materials that we know from the ancient world. The ancients didn't divide things in this way, right? Ancient culture was an organic whole. It wasn't possible simply to extract certain elements and ignore others. For example, let's simply look at Greek culture but put aside the religious element is complete absurdity. The religious element cuts all the way through almost every element of ancient Greek culture. I think this is also a valuable insight for us as educators with an investment in classical education. Again, very often religion is considered to be something different and separate from classical education. Some advocates of classical education even pride themselves on their religious tolerance or open-mindedness due to the fact that they don't teach any form of religion in the classroom, and they often regard teaching the religion as somehow suspect or inevitably doctrinal, and so we don't want to fall into the trap of indoctrinating our young students, and so better not to teach it at all. But here I think we can see a real rub with this view in the way in which the ancients conceived of things. Right? The modern view reflects certain negative conceptions about religion that come from the Enlightenment, that is, from Wolff's own time. Right? Whereas the ancient view fully embraced religion and made it an absolutely central part of their culture and of their daily life. So to say that one's interested in developing a program of classical education, but then to wholly seek to eliminate any trace of religion, it's simply contradictory. Such a program can never rightly be called classical. When you eliminate religion, you eliminate a major aspect of classical culture. This insight tells us that we need to think carefully about how we can integrate religion in a responsible manner in our programs of classical education. So that was point number 2. So for my third point, I want to focus on a set of prejudices and misconceptions surrounding the traditional argument for relevance that we've all heard many times, I'm sure. In these discussions, the argument goes that our modern culture derives largely from classical Greek and Roman culture. So in order to understand the foundations of modern society, we need to learn about the classics, right? Things such as our modern democracy, our literature, our drama, all of these things have their basis in ancient Greek culture, and so we need to learn about the Greeks. And when we do so, we are, in a sense, learning about ourselves, right? Because we are a continuation of that cultural tradition. And that this is often thought to be a strong counter-argument to those reproaches that we often hear to classical education for lacking relevance. But now, if we think about this for a minute, it'll be noted that this argument, it's based on the premise of influence. So the classics are classics precisely because they have exercised a major influence on subsequent Western thinking. This is why, again, according to the argument, we should prioritize the culture of the ancient Greeks and Romans in our educational programs. While this might sound at first glance convincing, the argument about influence is problematic if we reflect on it in more detail. And it raises a host of 3 different problems that I think will show how selective people tend to be in their conception of Greek and Roman culture and the role that it plays in our culture today. So, first, there are many aspects of Greco-Roman culture that don't really exert any meaningful influence whatsoever on our modern life today. Think of different aspects of Greek polytheism, the different stories they have about the gods and the goddesses. Okay, maybe this might be interesting or relevant for specialists in say, mythology or something like that, even specialists in certain aspects of certain periods of literature, okay. But today we don't have large cults of following Apollo or things of this sort. Right? One might argue that, okay, we have different groups of neo-pagans today who seem to have a continuing belief in the Greek gods as a living religion, but this is a modern phenomenon. This is not a continuous or organic growth that came out of the ancient Greek world. This is something different. We can argue about that if you want, but I think in this regard, I mean, nobody here believes the stories of the ancient gods. Nobody believes that Zeus has these extramarital affairs. Nobody believes these things anymore. You can't really be said to have exercised a major influence. And so, given this, right, we have to become aware that what we're identifying as key cultural elements from the Greek and Roman world and are designating in classics are things which are selectively chosen for our own interests and purposes, and things which we believe have in fact played a role in our modern society, but yet this is not always representative. And there are these other elements that, well, it was a part of ancient culture, part of Greek culture. It doesn't really have anything to do with us today. Well, if that's the case, then why should we privilege that and make that the centerpiece of our educational system if, in fact, there are these other elements which are simply not relevant? Then the relevance argument loses out. Yeah, the second, part and parcel with the idea of a classic in the sense of influence is that the work in question is one that's worthy of emulation, right? This is another meaning of the word classic. Somebody says, well, that's a classic, right? The idea being this is something that has great value or something that's of excellent quality. And so the idea is that the Greeks and the Romans, with their cultural achievements, they set the bar very high, and that the rest of us, we've all been trying to reach it ever since. And so Homer is a classic in the sense that later authors like Virgil or Dante, Milton, Joyce, they're all trying to imitate him, but can only do so imperfectly. So Homer is the classic in that sense. He represents an ideal that will always inspire later ages. And so this idea of a classic, it's invariably something positive, right? Something we want to imitate. It's something that we regard as valuable, a great cultural achievement. But here again, we need to be critical, right? There's a number of aspects of ancient Greek and Roman society that we can hardly regard today in any positive light whatsoever, right? The cultural arrogance and ethnocentrism of the Greeks, the positive disposition towards military conquest that saw virtue in defeating other peoples, the more or less universal institution of slavery, the merciless suppression of conquered people, the oppression of women, the widespread practice of torture, public execution, even at times for public entertainment. I could go on and on here, right? So let's make no mistake here, right? For all of our adulation of the great cultural achievements of the Greek and Roman world, there was plenty there that is and should be utterly abhorrent and repellent to us today. Should then we regard these institutions and cultural practices as classics? Once again, we can see that why should we give privilege of place to such cultures that engage in such terrible brutality and injustice? Are these values that we really want to impart to and instill in our young people today via a program of classical education? So the point here is it's not to knock Greek and Roman culture. The point is merely to bring home again how selective we tend to be when we think of Greek and Roman culture in the context of classical education. Right? There's a tendency to put their culture up on a pedestal and to ignore other aspects of it that don't fit well with this more humanistic picture that we as educators are usually trying to convey. Once again, this shows a serious deviation from the often sad reality of classical culture in all of its aspects. It's not representative, it's selective. Sadly, one could say that the relevance argument still works here. Europe and the West have, alas, inherited a number of these negative institutions and practices from the Greeks and the Romans, but the question that we have to ask ourselves here is whether this is really anything that we should be particularly proud of or that we would want to enshrine as the foundation of our educational system. Yeah, third, if we want to make the criterion for what a classic is the influence that it's had, then it has to be noted that this makes it independent of any specific culture, such as the Greeks and the Romans, in the sense that a classic text could in principle come from anywhere, provided that it exercised an important influence on the development of our modern thinking. Thus, this is not in and of itself an argument for studying Greek and Roman culture, rather it's an argument for studying what's been influential. If we take a look at the development of science and technology in the European Middle Ages, we find something quite interesting. We see the leading scientific works of that period come not from the Greeks, not from the Romans, not even from the later Europeans, but from authors from the Arab world. For example, Al-Battani's and Al-Kindi's works on astronomy, Al-Farabi's work on geometry, Avicenna's work on medicine, Abu Bashar's work on botany, on and on. These are all thinkers who had a major impact on the development of Western science. But oddly, we don't include them as a part of the classics, since they don't belong to the Greco-Roman world. But there's kind of an absurdity in this, because, of course, all of these Arabic authors are working with Aristotle. They're working in the Greek tradition in an odd way. So, but by the very criterion that the advocates of classical educations themselves give, namely influence, they should by all rights be included in our canon. But for whatever reason, these thinkers are generally neglected, although their influence, their de facto influence, has been so profound. Let me illustrate this with a simple example. In this school, in every other school in this country, you can always find zealous young students studying algebra, right? Key point in their education in mathematics. If you ask these young students, right, who was the founder of algebra, how many of them could come up with the name of Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, let alone the title of his main work, which is the foundation of algebra, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. Right? Ask those same students, right, who invented geometry? They'll tell you immediately, Euclid. Ask them who invented the fundamental laws of classical physics. They'll tell you Newton. Ask them who invented algebra. Right? Lots of fidgeting. Right? So the conclusion that we need to draw here is that our conception of classical education is overly narrow and perhaps somewhat prejudiced. If the goal of education is relevance in the sense of teaching our young people the things that they need to know about the origins and development of the society and culture that they live in, then we have to recognize that the Western tradition is a highly eclectic one that's always readily taken up and incorporated ideas from other cultures. Indeed, this is arguably one of the things that's made it great that it has been so eclectic. It's been so open for new ideas. So we need to make sure that the texts that we select for our canon are the ones that truly represent the development of human thought as a whole. Well, traditionally, this has always been associated with Western civilization. With this example, we can see that the picture it's far more complex than it's usually thought to be. One can't always speak of the West as if it's just this homogeneous, static unit. Instead, it's a complex combination of a number of different cultural traditions. So these examples from the natural sciences, religion, and other cultural traditions, besides the Greco-Roman tradition, should, I submit, enjoin us to rethink our traditional conceptions of classical education. They show us that there's much more to this than simply the traditional humanities fields. It's a simple prejudice to say that science and religion don't belong to classical education. This is in no way in harmony with the material itself or the way in which the ancient Greeks and the Romans themselves thought. It's likewise a prejudice to exclude other cultural traditions that have played an important role in the development of modern culture. It's a mistake just to insist on the Greeks and the Romans and to put them up on a pedagogical pedestal, right, of cultural perfection and moral infallibility. I think a more fruitful way of understanding classical education can be found in a concept from the 19th century German philosopher Hegel. Hegel makes this absolutely fundamental distinction in his philosophical system between what he calls nature and what he calls spirit. By nature, he means simply the physical world that surrounds us and that's governed by the laws of nature. By spirit, he means that the human mind and all of its products. This is what the cultural anthropologists today would simply call human culture. Right? So whatever human beings make, whatever institutions they have, whatever comes out of the human mind, that's what Hegel calls spirit, right? So you might think of nature as something that is simply out there immediately before we enter the world, but spirit is something that we as human beings collectively have to create in one way or another. And this involves not just the usual things that we tend to associate with culture, these highbrow things like academic fields of literature and history, but also much more fundamental things like language or technical expertise, religious beliefs, scientific knowledge, anything at all that comes from the human mind. And so once again, it's a prejudice, I think, that excludes science and technology from what we usually understand by culture. It's likewise a prejudice to exclude religion from culture. Perhaps most troublesome, it's a prejudice to exclude certain foreign traditions from culture. These are all the products of the human mind that have every right to deserve our respect and to be made the object of serious study. And here I think we can follow Hegel's lead and understand classical education as the understanding of the human spirit or mind in all of its forms. Thus, classical education should include all of these fields. It should also include all of the peoples of the world as interconnected, as a developing whole that is humanity in general. Let's then turn to the specifics of our globalized world and ask, what does this world demand of its citizens? Right? In modern discussions about education, the idea of an educational program that is suited for the globalized world in classical education, there's an idea of an educational program suited to the globalized world on the one hand and classical education on the other. They're usually thought of as being at opposite ends of the spectrum. Well, classical education is thought to be traditional or even reactionary. Any program for education in a globalized world is thought to be progressive and modern. The idea is that classical education has really nothing to offer us in the modern society of the 21st century. The Greeks and the Romans, they lived in a very different world. They had no inkling of the kind of problems of globalization that we're confronted with today. I wish to argue that this conception is also based on a set of modern prejudices. What do we really mean by globalization? This means living with an awareness that the entire world is interconnected in a myriad of different ways. These interconnections mean that we need to be attentive to people with different languages, different religious practices and beliefs, different traditions, different ways of thinking. We can no longer be content to just stick to our own isolated or local or regional groups. This all sounds very progressive and modern, but a closer look reveals that this conception was really nothing new to the Greeks or the Romans. It's a modern prejudice to think that globalization is something new. This prejudice comes from the experience of the rise of nationalism in the 19th and the 20th century, which gave priority to the nation state. It's against that background that globalization sounds like a new phenomenon, but in fact it's not. The Greeks were acutely aware of their neighboring peoples. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, Phoenicians, the Persians, educated Greeks like Herodotus, they went abroad to study these foreign cultures. They had a keen awareness of these other cultures and traditions. So also the Romans had this vast empire, and it contained a large number of conquered peoples with different languages, traditions, and religions. And Rome profited from its tolerance toward those differences. So given that, in some ways it's difficult to see how the experience of the Greeks and the Romans differed qualitatively from our modern experience of globalization. And so the idea of globalization is not a modern one, but rather an ancient one. So I see some people shaking their head. You think I'm exaggerating. Let me give you an example. Polybius, a Greek living in the 2nd century before Christ, wrote a history of, among other things, the Second Punic War, as you know, that pitted Rome against its arch enemy, Carthage. Polybius explains that this conflict took place between 218 and 201 BC. It was an epic event that signaled a major shift in history. Since both the Romans and the Carthaginians held colonies throughout the Mediterranean, the war covered a vast geographical area. And in his introduction, Polybius explains, I quote, "In earlier times, the world's history had consisted, so to speak, of a series of unrelated episodes, the origins and results of each being as widely separated as their localities. But from this point onwards, history has become an organic whole. The affairs of Italy and of Africa are connected with those of Asia and Greece, and all events bear a relationship and contribute to a single end," end quote. So here we can see already in antiquity, 2 centuries before Christ, the first glimpses of a globalized perspective. Polybius realizes that the conflict between Rome and North African Carthage, with this conflict, the world had in a sense become smaller. It was no longer possible just to pay attention to one's own private concerns in one's own local region. Now the Mediterranean world is interconnected, and what happens in one place has important consequences for what happens elsewhere. So Polybius's impassioned plea is that in order to understand this event that he's trying to describe, the Second Punic War, people need to adopt not a local or a specialized perspective, but a universal one, or what we would call a global one. He complains, quote, "It's impossible for us to achieve this comprehensive view from those histories which record isolated events. The fact is that we can obtain no more than an impression of a whole from a part, but certainly neither a thorough knowledge nor an accurate understanding," end quote. Polybius then finally goes on to propose his own view of universal history, what he calls universal history. Quote, "It is only by combining and comparing the various parts of the whole with one another and noting their resemblances and their differences that we shall arrive at a comprehensive view." So for Polybius, true understanding is possible only if we can see the whole picture and then we can place the individual parts in that broader context. Polybius's progressive vision, I think, is highly relevant for our global world today. Things that happen on one side of the globe more and more frequently have an important impact on things on the other side. The world has become smaller because of technological developments in communication, transportation, trade, and so forth. This has made everybody in the world our neighbor, so to speak. This presents new challenges to the social order, but for us concretely to education. Right? There have been other periods like this which have experienced an expansion of globalization. Here we might think of the 15th or 16th century, the discovery of the New World, or we might think of the first half of the 19th century, which saw a dramatically increased awareness of non-Western cultures and the birth of what has been referred to controversially as Orientalism, or called today Asian studies, with the foundation of the scholarly fields of Indology, Egyptology, Persian studies, and Arabic studies. Similarly, economists of the 18th and 19th century became aware of what we today refer to as the global economy, that is, ways in which modes of production and marketing of goods in one place expand and have an impact on different places around the world. In each of these periods, Europe was obliged to reevaluate its self-image and its position in the world. So the phenomenon of globalization, it's not unique to our modern world, but in fact it goes back through history. So here's, I think, an important insight for us as educators in this tradition. There's every reason to think that certain aspects of classical education that have been well suited to other periods in history, they might well be appropriate today. Why? Because globalization is not something new. It's something that's been there for quite a long time. Perhaps the key issue with globalization is that it means an increased awareness of one's place in the world as limited, as a member of one people, one society, one nation, one religion, vis-a-vis others. Now, this might sound quite straightforward, but there's a lot more implied here than immediately meets the eyes, especially with regard to its consequences for education. This means more than a simple respect for difference and otherness. I mean, that should be a given, of course, but it means more significantly, I think, a fundamental, dedicated, long-term effort to learn about the things that make people different, or as Polybius is, to learn about all the parts and all of their complexity in order to understand the whole. Here one starts to see that the idea of mutual respect is simply the visible tip of a very, very large iceberg. Well, globalized education means a systematic curriculum that educates young people in the history of all of the different peoples of the world, and different religions of the world, different traditions of the world, and science and technology. It's a much broader kind of a concept that's involved here. This means learning foreign languages. It means learning different modes of communication that will facilitate our interaction with people from all over the world. Only with such a full commitment, truly, to learn about the other, can one genuinely call oneself a fully fledged global citizen in the modern world. Here we can heed Polybius's words that true understanding is only possible with an overview of the whole. It's necessary to see the role of the part in the bigger picture, and only in this way are the part and the whole truly comprehensible. This is a daunting task, but I believe that with a revised model of classical education, we have the tools already in hand to accomplish this ambitious goal. So first, it's necessary to understand that science and technology, as a central part of our classical heritage, can be understood to be on an equal footing with literature, history, and the other fields which are traditionally associated with classical education. In this way, we can make classical education fit better with the demands of the fast-changing modern world, which is based, of course, on science and technology. Second, it's necessary to include instruction in religion as a part of classical education. We need to design programs that teach students the basics of the main religious traditions in order to prepare them for life in a multicultural and global society, since our young people will, of course, be encountering people from many different religious traditions. And finally, it's necessary to expand classical education to include other traditions that have also been influential on our modern society, on Western society. Classical education has always been about learning about different cultures. This needs merely to be expanded from an exclusive occupation with the Greeks and Romans to include other cultures of the world. Our young people will, of course, be meeting people from different countries, different traditions, and will need some understanding of these. So with these suggestions, it should be clear I'm not proposing any kind of a radical or revolutionary change. The basics of my proposal are already to be found in classical education if this concept is correctly understood. We don't need to start with something entirely new, but instead we can build upon our old strengths of classical education and expand upon them in a way that I think makes it more suitable for our times. And so given this, there's no reason why we as advocates of classical education need to feel like we're on the defensive or we need to seek desperately for arguments in order to justify our educational practices. I think a correct understanding of classical education provides us with everything that we need. But it should be noted that a part of this is a critical understanding, that is, an awareness of the limitations and shortcomings of the Greek and Roman world as the sole basis of our educational program. But as I see it, this critical understanding, that's a strength. It's not a weakness. We might have to abandon some cherished cliches or stereotypes about classical education, but nothing really is going to be lost by this. And ultimately, in the end, what we'll end up with is a dynamic and robust conception of education that will better serve our students in the challenges that they're going to meet in the future in our modern globalized world. So, thank you for your patience.